Have you ever wondered what happened to the iconic cast of The Dirty Dozen, 1967, after the cameras stopped rolling? This legendary war film not only delivered explosive action and a bold storyline, but also brought together some of Hollywood's biggest stars, men who became symbols of toughness and heroism on screen. But behind the fame and the unforgettable performances lies a different story, one filled with tragedy, lost dreams, and haunting twists of fate. In this video, we'll dive deep into the hidden chapters of their lives, uncovering the darker side of stardom, careers that faded too soon, personal battles fought in silence, and endings no one saw coming. Get ready, because what you're about to discover may just change the way you see these legends forever. George Kennedy, 1925. A towering figure with a voice as deep and commanding as his presence, George Kennedy was born into a world that would mirror the struggle and resilience he later brought to screen. He portrayed Major Max Armbruster in The Dirty Dozen, 1967, the no-nonsense military man whose steely resolve anchored the chaotic unit of misfits. Kennedy's career was rich with grit and authority. He shone in roles like Dragline in Cool Hand Luke, 1967, for which he won an Academy Award, and became a familiar face in disaster epics like Airport, 1970, and comedies like the Naked Gun series, showing unexpected warmth behind his rugged exterior. Yet beyond the spotlight, his life bore deep scars. His first wife, Dorothy Gillooly, left him, and though he remarried her later, their union ended again in divorce. Kennedy adopted several children, including Shauna Kennedy, whom he loved deeply, but their lives were not untouched by hardship. After the death of his beloved wife Joan McCarthy in 2015, his companion of over 50 years, George was left with a broken heart. His health declined rapidly, and he passed away in 2016 from heart disease, alone in an Idaho assisted living facility, far from the bright lights of Hollywood. The silence that followed his last breath was one of dignity and quiet sorrow, fitting for a man whose presence once filled every room he entered. Born in 1924, Lee Marvin portrayed the tough, cynical, and rebellious Major John Reisman in The Dirty Dozen, a role that seemed to echo parts of his own turbulent soul. Known for his steely glare and gravelly voice, Marvin brought an unmatched intensity to war films like The Big Red One, 1980, and The Killers, 1964. But behind his commanding presence was a man often adrift. Haunted by his own wartime experiences as a Marine in World War II, where he was seriously wounded during the Battle of Saipan, Marvin carried deep psychological scars. His personal life was no less stormy. A long and troubled marriage to Pamela Feely ended in divorce after decades of emotional distance and bouts of heavy drinking. Though they had 4 children, Marvin's connection with them seemed increasingly strained, lost in the haze of fame and personal demons. He found himself embroiled in a sensational legal battle in the late 1970s when his former partner Michelle Triola sued him in the landmark Palimony case, an ordeal that publicly exposed his private turmoil. In 1987, at just 63, Lee Marvin died of a heart attack following complications from an intestinal rupture. He passed away in Tucson, Arizona, far from the Hollywood lights, leaving behind a legacy carved in grit but shadowed by pain. Charles Bronson, born November 3, 1921, was the brooding soul behind the stoic Joseph T. Ladislaw, a demolition expert with a fierce quietude in The Dirty Dozen, 1967. Born Charles Dennis Buczynski in the coal mining town of Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania, he was one of 15 children in a poverty-stricken Lithuanian-American family. His early life was marked by brutal hardship. He began working in the mines at 10 and later served in World War II before drifting into acting. Bronson's rugged features and laconic presence made him an icon in tough guy roles, from Death Wish to Once Upon a Time in the West. Behind the camera, though, his life was shadowed by melancholy. His first marriage to Harriet Tendler ended in quiet heartbreak after decades, as his stoicism translated into emotional distance. His second wife, Jill Ireland, whom he loved deeply, died tragically of breast cancer in 1990, a loss from which he never truly recovered. Bronson spent his final years battling Alzheimer's disease in a twilight of fading memories, passing away on August 30, 2003, at 81, in Los Angeles. The once fearsome screen vigilante died silently, his fire dimmed, leaving behind 7 children and a legacy carved from granite and grief. Richard Yuckle, born October 10, 1926, portrayed the loyal and competent Sergeant Clyde Boren, the steady hand among chaos in the Dirty Dozen. With a career spanning over 4 decades, he was often cast as the dependable soldier, the rugged sidekick, the man who stayed when others ran. From Sands of Iwo Jima to Starman, Yuckle never rose to superstar status, but he was the backbone of countless films, his presence grounding the wildness of others. Off-screen, Yuckle was a quiet soul, a devoted family man who rarely made headlines. But tragedy found him late in life. After decades in Hollywood, he was diagnosed with cancer, and financial hardship followed. In a cruel twist, the industry he had supported failed him. He spent his last months in a convalescent home in Brentwood, California, largely forgotten by the world he helped build. He passed away on June 14, 1997, at the age of 70, leaving behind his wife Antoinette and 2 sons. There was no spotlight at the end, no final bow, only a quiet departure, a life of steady devotion and soft-spoken suffering fading gently into the past. Ernest Borgnine, born in 1917, brought gravitas and a surprising warmth to the role of General Wardens, the high-ranking officer who initiates the controversial mission in the Dirty Dozen. A prolific actor whose career spanned over 6 decades, Borgnine won an Academy Award for his heartbreaking performance as the Lonely Butcher in Marty, 1955. But beyond his hearty laugh and seemingly indestructible presence on screen in films like From Here to Eternity, 1953, and Escape from New York, 1981, Borgnine's real life was marked by a series of failed marriages, 5 in total, including a famously disastrous 32-day union with singer Ethel Merman. His relationships were often volatile, marred by misunderstandings and emotional distance. Though he eventually found lasting companionship with his 5th wife, Tove Tresnes, Borgnine often spoke of regrets, of time lost and bonds never mended, especially with his children from earlier marriages. In his final years, his once booming energy faded. He passed away in 2012 at the age of 95 from kidney failure. Despite the long life and accolades, there was a quiet sadness in his final interviews, a hint that behind the legendary smile was a man who had seen love slip through his fingers too many times. John Cassavetes, born December 9, 1929, brought a simmering, dangerous intensity to Victor R. Franco, the rebellious and unpredictable killer in the Dirty Dozen. Known not just as an actor but as a pioneering force in independent cinema, Cassavetes was a fiercely uncompromising artist who poured raw humanity into films like Faces, A Woman Under the Influence, and The Killing of a Chinese Bookie. Born to Greek immigrant parents in New York City, he fought against Hollywood's polished veneer, opting instead for emotional realism and fractured souls. His marriage to actress Gina Rowlands was both tempestuous and tender, a creative and passionate bond that endured despite his deep personal demons. Cassavetes was a man constantly wrestling with the world, sometimes retreating into alcohol and turmoil. His relationships with his children were shaped by his volatility. He loved them fiercely, yet often left them to navigate the storm of his genius. Diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver, his health deteriorated throughout the 1980s. He died on February 3, 1989, at just 59, his body ravaged by years of intensity and struggle. In the end, the man who gave life to such explosive characters succumbed to his own inner blaze, gone too soon, mourned by a family who both adored and endured him. Triny Lopez, 1937. With a voice that danced between joy and pain, Triny Lopez lit up every stage and screen he touched. As Pedro Jimenez in The Dirty Dozen, 1967, he brought charisma and vibrance to a role that, in a cruel twist of Hollywood fate, was cut short, his character being one of the earliest to die, echoing the abruptness that would later define much of his life. A singer as well as an actor, Triny soared to fame with hits like If I Had a Hammer and Lemon Tree, his music resonating with the hopes of a generation. Born to Mexican immigrants in Dallas, Texas, he carried their dreams on his back as he climbed to fame, often at the cost of his own personal peace. Never married, he kept his private life guarded, even as he longed for stability and intimacy. Friends often remarked on his loneliness. Fame surrounded him, but connection eluded him. In his final years, Lopez was celebrated quietly, with occasional performances, his legendary Gibson guitar design outliving even his most memorable songs. But in 2021, during the dark days of the pandemic, he succumbed to complications from COVID-19. He died isolated in a Palm Springs hospital, no farewell applause, no final encore. Just a fading voice that once thrilled millions, silenced far too soon. Ralph Meeker, 1920. Ralph Meeker, born in Minneapolis in 1920, carried a brooding intensity that seeped into every performance he gave. As Captain Stuart Kinder in The Dirty Dozen, 1967, Meeker embodied the role of the Army psychiatrist tasked with evaluating the condemned men, a quiet figure of internal struggle amid a sea of chaos. Known best for his role as the hard-boiled private Mike Hammer in Kiss Me Deadly, 1955, Meeker's career burned bright for a time before slowly flickering into obscurity. He never married and kept his private life fiercely guarded, often vanishing from Hollywood's glare. Behind the scenes, he battled frustration over being typecast, his classical stage background stifled by the narrow roles he was offered. In the final years of his life, Meeker suffered from a debilitating series of strokes that left him largely incapacitated. He died in 1988 in a nursing home in Woodland Hills, California, far from the soundstage lights and applause that once embraced him. His passing was quiet, nearly forgotten by the industry he helped shape, a lonely end to a life once filled with promise and presence. Robert Ryan, 1909. There was always something haunted in Robert Ryan's eyes, a deep sorrow behind the authority he so often portrayed. Born in Chicago in 1909, Ryan came from a well-off family, but his was not a childhood of comfort. It was shadowed by the emotional distance of wealth and the cold expectations of his businessman father. In The Dirty Dozen, 1967, Ryan portrayed Colonel Everett Dasher Breed, a rigid and elitist officer whose contempt for the titular team mirrors the judgment Ryan himself may have felt in Hollywood's tight-lipped circles. Though acclaimed for roles in Crossfire, 1947, and The Wild Bunch, 1969, he was often cast as the heavy, despite being a deeply principled man off-screen, a pacifist and civil rights activist in an industry that rarely rewarded such stances. His marriage to Jessica Cadwallader, a fellow activist and writer, was intense but marked by hardship, particularly as she fell ill with cancer. Her death in 1972 devastated him. The following year, Ryan himself was diagnosed with lung cancer, a cruel irony for a man who had served his country in World War II and preached nonviolence. He died just weeks after filming wrapped on his final role, his thin frame ravaged by illness. He passed away in 1973 at age 63, alone in his New York apartment, his body betrayed by years of quiet suffering. His death left behind not just children, but a legacy of unresolved contradictions, a fierce man in gentle causes, a leading man who never found peace. Jim Brown, born February 17, 1936, was the embodiment of unshakable strength as Robert T. Jefferson in The Dirty Dozen, a man of few words, commanding silence and respect with his presence alone. Before he graced the screen, Brown had already become a legend on the football field, considered one of the greatest to ever play the game. But the field couldn't contain him. He stormed into Hollywood with the same ferocity, starring in films like 100 Rifles and Slaughter, breaking racial barriers and redefining black masculinity in cinema. Yet behind the myth, the man was complicated. Raised by a single mother on St. Simon's Island, Georgia, Brown's early life was fractured and filled with absence. His relationships were marred by volatility. Accusations of domestic violence followed him for years, and though he married twice and fathered several children, intimacy often eluded him. He longed for control, yet seemed at war with himself. In his final years, the once mighty titan receded into silence, suffering from deteriorating health and fading from the public eye. On May 18, 2023, Jim Brown died at the age of 87 in Los Angeles. His wife Monique was at his side, but the legacy he left behind was as complex as the man himself: hero, icon, warrior, and storm. What do you think about the deaths of the actors in The Dirty Dozen, 1967, and who do you miss the most among them? Leave your comments below and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to see the latest videos.